Hello again. One of the things which I find utterly fascinating is the way in which London, the city in which I was born and grew up, is now routinely claimed to be somewhere which was always multi-ethnic. I find this intriguing because I know, and so do many older people, that this is completely false. Any photographs of London from 50 years ago or more, like the one in the thumbnail to this video, will reveal the lie. And yet, every period drama set in Victorian London will depict the city teeming with black people. It's all very odd. I was born in the East End of London, Custom House down by the docks. Then we lived for a time in Bethnal Green before moving to Ilford, which was a definite step up in the world. Ilford was a very respectable place in those days. I can say with assurance that I did not attend school, either primary or secondary, with a single black person or Asian, and that I did not even speak to a black person until years after leaving school. There were literally no black people in Ilford in the 1960s, when I was a teenager, and perhaps a tiny number of Sikhs living in Seven Kings, which is near Ilford. Particularly, they bought up places in Pembroke Road. That's another story entirely. This was the same picture for the whole of London, other than one or two districts like Brixton and parts of Notting Hill. The entire city was white. It was the capital of Britain, and it was a British city. I shouldn't have to say that, obviously, but I mean, yes, it was in those days. Don't take my word for it. Just look at a few photographs from the time. School photographs in London taken in the 1950s and mid-1960s show that almost every school in the city was 100% white. I emphasise this point because I have read a few modern books on anti-racism published in this country, and they describe this idea as a fantasy. It is claimed that the big cities of Britain have always been racially mixed. This is simply not true. In London, until the arrival of the Empire Windrush in 1948, one might have seen the odd black sailor around the London docks. These people were generally waiting for a berth on a ship. They didn't actually live in the city. For 20 years after the arrival of the Windrush, small numbers of black people and those from the Indian subcontinent started arriving, but they lived in specific places, and it was perfectly possible to live and work in London at that time without encountering any person of colour or any foreigner. 50 years ago, I was living in Ilford and commuting to the city, and I do not recollect seeing a single black person in my day-to-day life. Again, just look at photographs of commuters in London in 1971 and you'll see the truth of this. I'm hammering this point home rather because I want to ensure that those watching understand the nature of what has happened to the capital. In the London borough of Redbridge, which is where I lived 50 or 60 years ago, and it contains the town of Ilford, there were no black people to be found. Only a third of the people in that borough are now white British, according to the 2011 census. Somewhere over the last 50 years, white people became a minority there. And the reality is that since 2011 things have changed even more. I would be very surprised if white British people now make up more than 20 or 25% of the population of Redbridge. I visit Ilford sometimes, and I can assure viewers that barely a quarter of the people one sees are white, and of those many look and sound Eastern European. Ilford is now a foreign town. The picture is much the same elsewhere in Hackney. I'm not talking now of inner city areas such as Hackney, which became this way some years ago, but of what were once nice quiet suburbs. London has fallen and is now occupied by foreigners. This may not, of course, necessarily be a bad thing. It is entirely possible that the benefits brought to the city by this transformation are in some ways an improvement, but that it has happened is undeniable. The capital of Britain is no longer a British city. The only examples of this happening to a country's capital which I can bring readily to mind are those in which a country has been invaded and the capital taken over by enemy troops. I cannot think of a single example in peacetime where the capital city of any country has ceased to have a majority of that country's citizens living in it.